Hello, everyone. How are you all doing today, wherever you may be today? So, pretty basic agenda. GMAT or GRE? Which one is better for you? We'll start here. Among other things you may notice, there was a time when I had hair. This is obviously an old picture of me. Alyssa, the woman who creates all the slides, she said, "Oh my God, yeah, send me a new picture." I'm like, yeah, I'll do that sometime. So I have a first and essential question for the group. Everyone who's watching and can respond in the chat. Type in, let me know, have you taken a real test, a practice test, if you have some awareness of the tests, if you are just beginning. Is anybody out there taking a real test or taking some practice tests particularly? Okay. Mostly B's, C's, 1D, 1A. All right. Next thing. Is anyone leaning heavily towards one test over the other? Leaning towards GRE, a few people, one person undecided. Mr. Great 1234. You should be applying to schools. For those of you who are leaning heavily towards one test over the other, could you take a moment and type in the chat why? What is it that is leaning you towards one test over the other? And Karina, I do anticipate taking some time today to talk about the online tests. Not yet seeing any responses on why people would be leaning towards one test over the other. I will keep an eye out for those responses, though. It's always intriguing to me to find heard verbal is easier in the GMAT and is accepted by more business schools. And leaning GRE because the math is simpler. I'm just chuckling because that is a very, very common response to whenever I have discussions with students about this particular question. People lean towards one because they feel it is easier. In reality, I would argue that neither test is easier, actually. There are differences between the test, and we need to establish which differences make the test feel easier for any individual. And there is some rationale behind that, and we will discuss that as we keep going on here. Mr. Great 1234, that 325 is not sufficient for top business schools, having been dinged once. Top business schools want that quantitative score 165 or higher. And usually if you can get your verbal score into the 160s, they would be happy. That score profile is generally enough to get the school to take a look at the rest of your application. I would argue that with that score profile, you would probably want to take one more try at the GRE because you already have some established strengths there. And that's one of the issues that we need to discuss today. How do we decide which test to start with? And how do we decide when to continue with a test versus when to switch and move towards another test? What are the differences? Where can I take a full GMAT? Well, I can tell you that my company, Manhattan Prep, offers free practice tests that we have published for each test, GRE and GMAT. We can share that link with you in a moment. So you can always start there, and you can take a full practice test in that way. I should mention now ETS, the organization that makes the GRE, and GMAC, the organization that makes the GMAT. Each of those organizations share full practice tests of their test. There are official practice GRE tests available online, and there are official practice GMATs available online. Do not take those yet. Save those official practice tests until you've established your target score and have scored within a few points difference. 2 to 3 points difference on the GRE. And when I say 2 to 3 points, I mean 2 to 3 points in your subscores. 2 to 3 points away from your quantitative target subscore, 2 to 3 points away from your verbal subscore. On the GMAT, 20 to 30 total points away from your score. When you are within range of your target score, that is when you transition to official practice tests. But I would urge you to not use those official tests until that time. They are more limited, you have fewer of them, and you want to save those for the closest to the test day practice tests you can, because they are the most like the real thing. Storage.com, I'm thinking to applying for engineering school. I would say your decision has been made for you. If you're applying to an engineering school, you're pretty much settled on the GRE. That's almost certainly the case. You'd want to reach out to your target schools and find out, but that is the most common thing. Let's talk about some basics of the tests. The essential stats for the basics for the GMAT. You can score is valid for 5 years. It costs this much to register. That cost is different for the online version. Administered 6 days per week, all year long, and you must wait 16 days to retake. The rules for the GMAT are very simple. You have nothing. You have no modern day implements that would make this more approachable. That sounds very, very intimidating, but the test is very, very, very well engineered for that. You get results immediately, and the MBA programs will consider only your highest scores. And Thomas, yes. Use the links sent and study books until you are near your score. GMAT Basics, again, you have a quant section scored 6 to 51, 62 minutes, 31 questions. Some basic math there means about 2 minutes per question. Verbal scores 6 to 51, 65 minutes, 36 questions. The math there is not quite as basic. You have 3 different question types on the GMAT. You want to move far more quickly on these sentence correction types than on the others. And I should make a note here, this verbal score, realistically, 6 to 46. There are, in theory, 51 possible points on the verbal section of the GMAT. In practice, however, the verbal subscores hit 99th percentile at 45. So 45 and 46, you're already into the 99th percentile. What this means as a practical matter, is the computer does not have enough test takers scoring between 47 and 51 to have a reliable data bank of questions, a reliable data bank of questions for those score ranges. And so there is no realistic way to reliably plan for a verbal score of higher than 46. So once you hit around a 44 or 45 on verbal, you should look at that as the highest realistic plan you can make. Those two scores combine very literally. The algorithm literally adds up those two subscores to put you within a 20-point window for your overall reported total score. You have an integrated reasoning section, which has zero impact on the 3-digit total score. It is scored separately on its own. And an essay, which again has zero impact on the 200 to 800 total score. That is scored on its own as well. Here is where, if we're discussing GMAT versus GRE, the GMAT would have an advantage in this concept. You know which sections you get in what order. Now, this screen applies only to the in-person test. The online version is choice 2 with no essay. So you cannot choose for the online version, but you do know the order of the sections. That can be played to your advantage. Another challenging aspect of the online version is the fact that there is no break between quant and verbal. You must be prepared to sit there for a little over 2 hours. When we are at a point in time where we're back to taking in-person tests, however, you would realistically be doing choice 1 or choice 2. Choice 2 or choice 3. You would never, ever, ever want to go for choice 1. That would just be, you'd be draining your energy for an hour before you started to the stuff that really honestly matters. Just a quick check for understanding of the scoring algorithm. Which of these two score profiles gets a higher score? Student 1, who reaches very high difficulty levels and gets a substantial number of those very high difficulty levels correct, but trails off at the end. Or student 2, who never reaches the highs of student 1, but also never trails off at the end. Which of these two students would receive the higher score? I'd like for everyone to take a moment, respond in the chat. Two people responding with 2. Yeah. Looks like we're all on board with this. That is very true. It would be student 2. The GMAT is about consistent performance throughout the entirety of the section, and the scoring algorithm views a drop-off at the end as an indication that you did not manage your time wisely. And the scoring algorithm is meant to penalize that test taker. So you want to be student 2 who reaches some consistency and maintains that consistency throughout the entirety of the section. Alex, why do you say unfortunately? It is a very intriguing addition to that comment. Unfortunately, student 2 gets a higher score. Does anyone else feel that way? That this is an unfortunate aspect of the test? Oh, Now that's a fun one. Let me take a moment. Let's see if I can get back and just talk to you guys for a moment. It is very, very difficult to do the difficult questions. Yes. You're not supposed to do the most difficult questions on the GMAT. The GMAT is testing your ability to do cost-benefit analysis, to recognize which problems will be too expensive no matter the potential reward of getting them right. And so what the GMAT is looking for you to do is to look at some questions and say, even if I know how to do it, I know how much it would cost in terms of the time, and I know it's not worth that. Therefore, I'll make my guess, move on, and just let that go. Making those decisions is what the GMAT wants from us. And so quite hard to do the difficult questions? Yes. The counterpart to that is you are actually not supposed to do them. My GMAT club representative is scared because he's worried that I took down the presentation deliberately. Yes, I did. Just wanted to have a moment to make sure that, a bit more of a conversation than just staring at a blank screen. All right. GRE. Roughly speaking, a similar cost. There is a $45 difference. Again, other similar stats on the number of years it's valid and when it's offered. You must wait a little bit more time to retake it, but not so much to be a deal breaker. Gosh, very hard to concentrate and on very lengthy text and verbal. Is GRE a better for me in that case? No. They are actually both equivalent in that regard. The longest GRE reading comprehension passages are as long as the longest GMAT reading comprehension passages. And in fact, the analogous questions for sentence construction, text completion and sentence equivalence on the GRE versus sentence correction on the GMAT, the longest text completion examples on the GRE are actually significantly longer than the sentence correction examples on the GMAT. That's not where the difference lies. We will talk about those differences in just a moment. Rules for the GRE, you have the use of an on-screen calculator. Please be aware that calculator is very, very rudimentary. You have multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, and you have a square root button and nothing else. And it cannot handle very large numbers. So for example, if you were asked to calculate 21 raised to the 11th power, you would think, I can do that with a multiplication button, 21 times 21 times 21 times 21, 11 times over, and just be very, very careful how many times you do it. The calculator would fail at a number that large. At a certain point, it would just stop calculating. The score is, again, available immediately, except for the essay. And if you take the multiple exams, you can choose which is reported to your school. That is a distinction that makes no difference, GMAT versus GRE. Your schools that you apply to will see all of your GMAT scores. You can, if you choose, make sure that the schools you apply to only see one GRE score. But the schools are very, very, very direct about this, and they are very, very honest about this. It does not matter how many different scores they see. They want to know the highest score, and they will judge you based on that and that alone. So this seems appealing that you can choose to show only one score. In reality, it makes absolutely zero difference to your applications. I mentioned a moment ago that the GMAT has a predictable order. You will know which sections you will get in what order. That is not the case for the GRE. You start with your essays. Then you do verbal, quantitative, and a fifth section. You will not know the ordering of those sections. And one of those will be unscored. You will probably not know which one is unscored. There is a similar aspect to the GMAT as well. The GMAT has experimental questions. There will be approximately 5 questions in each section that are experimental and that are not scored for you, and you will not know which of those questions are experimental. Both tests have experimental components. So you have this random ordering of sections. You will not know which ones comes first. But the way the scoring works on the GRE is slightly different from the GMAT. It is section adaptive as opposed to question adaptive. So you have your first section, your first verbal, your first quantitative is a standard verbal, standard quant. Your performance on the first scored verbal determines where you land on the second verbal section. Harder, medium, easier. Your performance on the first scored quantitative section determines which second scored quantitative section you get. Harder, medium, easier. And essentially this scoring runs with your harder and medium create floors and ceilings that you can't go above or below. So for example, let's say that harder puts you at a cap of like 170 and then goes down to, let's say, 157 if you do very, very poor on the harder section. The medium has a cap at 163 with a floor of, let's say, 148. Please be aware I am making these numbers up. They're fairly realistic examples, but these are not official score ranges for the medium sections, but this is a visual of how the scoring works. If you do well enough in the first section to get into the harder, there is a score you will not fall below, and you could get the max score. There is considerable overlap, however, between the sections. If you do okay in the first section, but then do really well in the second medium section, you would then get a score that is comparable to a moderate to poor performance on the harder section. That's how the scoring works on the GRE. Questions, comments, concerns about differences in the scoring algorithm? I don't see any questions yet. I will keep in mind. All right. GMAT versus GRE frequently asked questions. Pretty much every school now accepts the GRE. Oh, here we go. Let's take a moment. Go back for a moment. Thinking of switching to the GRE because of GMAT Online Whiteboard. Okay. Nobody is particularly happy about the online whiteboard. That's just an honest assessment. Nobody's that thrilled about it. That said, it is not the crushing impediment most people I speak to seem to believe it is. You must very irritatingly use a mouse instead of any kind of stylus tool. That's always fun. But if you change the mouse speed on your computer and knock the mouse speed down 1 or 2 notches, it's actually a surprisingly usable interface. The whiteboard, it actually has some advantages on the verbal section. If you decide to make notes for reading comprehension passages, your notes can be right there next to the passage. If you decide to make Notes for critical reasoning. Your notes can be right there below the critical reasoning prompt. The ability to have on-screen notes for the verbal section is actually an advantage to that. The obvious disadvantage is in quantitative because it's a pain in the butt trying to hand draw equations or anything like that. That said, most GMAT quant questions are not primary equation-driven questions. And so it has less of an impact there than you would think. Bluntly speaking, the worst part about it is geometry. You have to draw the figures to handle a geometry question, and that's not particularly convenient using mouse and whiteboard. But it can be done. The online whiteboard, you just need to make sure you get around 20 hours of practice with it before you go in and take the actual test. And that does not mean 20 hours of practice devoted exclusively just to the whiteboard. That 20 hours of practice can be you reviewing problems you've already attempted, you trying new problems, you trying a timed set, and ultimately trying a full practice test with the online whiteboard. One other quick note to make, again, just a shameless plug. Manhattan Prep, the group the organization I represent, we have an online whiteboard for our practice tests already, and it is actually a complete and utter copy. It is identical to the one you'd see on the actual test. Wish to prevail. Let me know if I have addressed the whiteboard concerns sufficiently or if you have any remaining concerns. Bluntly speaking, I would expect you to have remaining concerns simply because of the new interface, but I'm trying to get across the idea that it is an obstacle that you can overcome if you are already comfortable with the rest of the test. If you are comfortable with the GMAT and the whiteboard is the only thing making you want to switch to GRE, don't switch. Stay with the test you're more comfortable with. You can adapt to the interface more quickly than you think. Is it true that the first section holds more importance in the GRE? Kind of, in that it does set the framework where your final score must rest between. But the GRE and GMAT, the difference there is the GMAT is scored entirely, and I mean entirely, on one metric. At what difficulty level did you start missing questions almost half the time? The computer will find a difficulty level where you miss questions close to half the time. The score is based merely on what was that difficulty level. The GRE is considerably less devoted to difficulty and is far more traditional. How many did you get correct? So Siraj says quant of GRE is quite easy. I'm guessing compared to the GMAT? That's the issue with GRE versus GMAT. On an individual basis, most quant questions on the GRE, not all, most quant questions in the GRE tend to feel a little bit easier, a little bit less tricky than the similar types of quant questions on the GMAT. But there is no room for error, certainly less room for error. So the GRE is more traditional in that you have to get them all correct. The GMAT is adopt the mindset of I am meant to choose my battles and decide which questions are not worth the time. And that buys me time for other questions so I know I will get those correct. Whichever of those two mindsets you adapt best, that will be your better test, at least on the quantitative side. My strengths lie in GRE rather than GMAT. Anisha, the GRE rather than GMAT, more obvious choice for an MBA program, that is not actually true anymore. That was probably true around 3 to 4 years ago. That's not actually true anymore. There are a few schools which still have a preference for GMAT, but that is not true of most, and that's not true of the top tier schools. If I had a choice to take the online or offline GMAT, I would take the offline GMAT simply because that's the one where I can still choose the sections. And me personally, I would prefer to start with verbal. That is the only reason why I would choose offline rather than online. However, that is also because I am not particularly bothered by the thought of sitting for 2 hours and focusing straight for that. It requires some management. I would need a moment just to close my eyes, take a few breaths. I would need to do that periodically throughout the sections, but I can do that. And so those are the reasons I would take the offline version. For me, the ability to choose the section order is more important, and the inconvenience of not having a break between the two main sections, quant and verbal, is not that much of an impediment for me. I cannot know if the same is true for you, but those are actually your primary concerns, online versus offline. The virtual whiteboard is a pain. It is not convenient. Nobody likes it, but it will not be that much of a deciding factor if you have done about 20 hours of practice to get used to it. You just have to make sure you have those 20 hours of practice. Wish to prevail. I mean, there is so much of this is very much about your mindset. If you walk into the test with a virtual whiteboard thinking that the virtual whiteboard crushes everything for me, it will. There is also another aspect to that as well, GMAT versus GRE. If you want to know which sections you get in which order, if knowing you will start with section X, follow that up with section Y, if that gives you great comfort, then you take the GMAT. If that comfort is outweighed by knowing that you could possibly go back and look at a question you tried earlier, you take the GRE. Now, again, there's a lot of nuance there where the GRE is, you can go back and look at a question you've attempted before. Realistically, no, you won't have time. You can maybe go back and review 1 or 2 questions if you're fast. But realistically, you don't normally have time to go back and review GRE questions. But people like knowing that they have that option. It's a sort of a security issue where people feel more secure knowing that if they click the answer to a question and they decide to come back and change it, that is an option within the mechanics of the test. Yash, if you're good at memorizing and therefore good at vocabulary, the decision for you is made. You should probably take the GRE. My one caution there is I am not very good with critical reasoning. You will not escape critical reasoning on the GRE. It's just a slightly different style of critical reasoning. The vocab-based questions on the GRE do require immense of critical reasoning, but it's less about recognizing things like cause and effect logic or percent versus number relationships, and more about following a complicated sentence which switches positions and switches whether something is supposed to be positive or negative. And so that type of critical reasoning, the critical reasoning of assessing tone and intended meaning in a sentence, is more prevalent on the GRE. Thomas, yes, of course, my pleasure. How do the tests work for extensive note takers for myself and make notes for section? Mr. Great One, the whiteboard would actually prove to be a boon to you, which, by the way, if anybody was not familiar with the word boon, you may not want to take the GRE. But the whiteboard is actually a help in the verbal section on the GMAT. The ability to type your notes, and most people these days type much more quickly than they write. The ability to use a text tool to type your notes, and the ability to have your notes there on screen next to the prompt and answer choices is much more beneficial than having to go back, write on your paper, look up, write on your paper, look up, write on your paper. The whiteboard is actually very, very nice on the verbal section for the GMAT. How would I compare verbal section of GMAT and GRE? If you are very, very comfortable with slightly antiquated and unusual English vocabulary, or if you think you can become comfortable with that, the GRE might be the better option. In fact, I notice on the screen you guys can see the books here behind me, the Tolkien set back there. Novelists like Tolkien, other individuals like him, if you are very, very comfortable with the language used in works like that, you would actually be very comfortable with the language usage on the GRE. The GMAT is more about rule-based analysis on the verbal section. There are certain rules for subject, verb, agreement, and punctuation. There are certain rules for parallel constructions. There are rules for certain modifier constructions. And if you like to have this ability to go through, I check this rule, then this rule, then this rule, then this rule, the GMAT would be better for you. Critical reasoning / reading comprehension, not that different between the two tests. What would my recommendation be, GMAT versus GRE? It has nothing to do with the content. GMAT versus GRE is entirely about which mindset you can reflect best. If you can adapt to the mindset of, I will do my best on this question, but I do not have to answer every question correctly, and I am not supposed to attempt every question. I am meant to triage a question as I see it into, yes, I can do it, I think I can do it, let's give it some time, versus, hell no, this problem is not going to happen in the time that I have. If you can become comfortable with that triage mindset, the GMAT will probably be a better test for you. If you will never be comfortable with that mindset, you should take the GRE. A minimum GRE of 90th percentile, but only a minimum score of 650 on the GMAT. That is strange. That's not quite an apples to apples comparison in terms of percentiles. Sushil, that may likely be your target school is less comfortable with using GRE scores as an indicator of ability to perform inside the school. And if so, that is likely merely an indication that they just do not have enough numbers yet. They have not had enough GRE applicants that they wanted to admit to feel comfortable making sure that that's correct. I will say, anyone who you talk to who tries to do, well, a GRE score of blank is equivalent to a GMAT score of blank, they either don't really know the way it works, or they're trying to sell you something. GRE of 90th percentile versus a 650 of GMAT, the percentiles don't quite match up between the two subscores there, or like the main scores there, but they're not meant to. They're different scoring scales. In fact, ETS's GMAT to GRE score converter, one of my colleagues put his GRE score into that once and asked what would be the equivalent score on the GMAT, and it responded with a GMAT score that does not exist. Like a subscore that does not exist on the test. It was a very strange thing. So there is no apples to apples comparison of the scores. People who are trying to make that are doing their best with an imperfect situation. That makes sense, Sushil. Yep. Let's get back to the slides here. And with 20 minutes left in today's presentation, I do want to make sure that we do one particular thing. Yeah, 170 GRE Quant is a 53 in GMAT Quant. 50, there is no 53. It stops at 51. Let me just click through a few slides here. I want to make sure that, first of all, almost all schools accept the GRE. There are a few which still have a preference GMAT versus GRE. That's check with your target schools if you need. Quantitative on the GRE will have more geometry. It has multi-answer problems. GMAT, the main thing there, logic. There is more maximization, minimizing, how do numbers behave style logic on the GMAT. All right. I'm just going to click this up real quickly. All right. I don't know of any business schools anymore that require the GMAT. Possibly London, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Sorry. Lean GMAT affinity schools prefer the GMAT. There are a few of those that still exist. If you want to go into financial consulting, the choice has been made for you. You will take the GMAT. I have had students in my GMAT classes who were actually about to finish their MBA, but they had been admitted to the MBA program on the basis of a GRE score. And now they were applying with consulting firms, and the consulting firms were requiring them to take the GMAT and have the GMAT score as part of their hiring process. So if you want to go into consulting, you're taking the GMAT. It's done. If you've already invested significant time in one test, acknowledge that quantitative content and some verbal content will transfer fairly one-to-one between the two tests. But there is some verbal content that will not transfer one-to-one at all. If you're thinking of switching from GMAT to GRE, you will need to spend at least 5 weeks really diving into vocabulary studies. There is no way around that. If you're thinking of switching GRE to GMAT, you will need to spend 3 to 4 weeks making sure you become accustomed to certain grammar rules that exist on the GRE but are not directly tested. Those are the main things in terms of content. You will need to, during those 3 to 5 weeks, also make sure you become accustomed to some of the different question styles. Sentence correction on the GMAT versus text completion on the GRE. Data sufficiency on the GMAT versus quantitative comparison on the GRE. In top business schools, what is the percentage of admits taking GMAT and GRE? Oh my goodness, I was just looking at these numbers about 3 weeks ago. I think right now, and Siddharth, let me be very, very clear, this is, I think, that it's around 80-20. Last year's admit class. 80% GMAT, 20% GRE was a rough average for the applicants in the top schools. Please do not quote me on that. I'm going of memory from something I looked up 3 weeks ago for a brief period of time. I think I've already addressed everything that is already on this slide. Bottom line for this, I understand the hesitancy, and I personally would also have hesitancy, and this is coming from somebody who works online all the time. I would have some hesitancy about the virtual whiteboard on the online GMAT. That said, for most people, it will not actually kill their score. There will be a few hindrances in quantitative. However, that would be objectively outweighed by the opportunities it offers in verbal. You just need time to become accustomed to it. For me, GRE versus GMAT is entirely about how critical is it to you that you have that security blanket of knowing you can come back to a question. If knowing that you were not sure on a question and you will not be able to come back to it, if that just causes incredibly severe anxiety in you, then the GRE is probably a better test for you. And that has nothing to do with content or scoring in any way, shape, or form. It is merely about which style of test better fits your test-taking emotional abilities, really. Bottom line, if you're not sure, take a practice test in each. Take some time learning about the timing recommendations. There are various blog posts on the Manhattan Prep site, but just bluntly make sure you know the timing benchmarks for each. And you just want to take a practice test. Time frame. Minimum of 3 to 5 weeks, no matter what, if you're going to switch. Acknowledge that, plan for it. Moment. And let's try a few problems before we end with some question and answer here. I'll give you about a minute to consider this question. Take a few moments. First of all, indicate all such values. The squares next to the answer choices is a visual reminder that you might be picking multiple options. If n is divisible by both 4 and 21, then we can break these down into their component pieces and get a collection of things that n must have. So n would have a 2. I don't know whether n would have an 8. It has 2 2s, but not necessarily a third. A 12 is a 2, and a 3. N has a 2, and a 3. A 14 is a 2 and a 7. N would have a 2 and a 7. A 24 is an 8 and a 3, and again, I don't know about an 8. A 42 is a 7 and a 6. N would have a 7. It would have a 3. It would have a 2. It would have a 42. GMAT style might be something like this. Take a moment, consider this one. It seems a little stranger, possibly, than the previous question. But we can look at this and we could say a is a positive integer. And I want to know the units digit of a squared is 9. Well, that's not a 0. 0 squared is not 9. Not a 1, not a 2. 3 might work. Not a 4, not a 5, not a 6. 7 squared is 49. So that would check off. 8 would be 64, 9 would be 81. Those are all units digits. The units digit of a plus 1, which would be either 4 or 8. You check a plus 1 squared. 4 squared is 16. 8 squared is 64. There's the more units digit is 4. So we now know we are looking at the second row only. A plus 2 would be 9. 9 squared is 81. What is the units digit of a plus 2 squared? That would be 1. Now, before I address some of the questions that have come in the chat window since I've started doing some problems with you here, I want to point out two things. How much algebra existed in those problems? 0. There is just enough actual algebra on the tests to make people believe that it is an algebra test. They are not. Your best approach to quantitative for both of the tests is to ask, can I do this in some non-algebraic fashion? Some way to organize my thoughts, test cases, and see what components I have. Why do consulting companies prefer a GMAT test? Arun, you would have to ask them. My suspicion, consulting companies know that the GMAT directly tests the ability to do cost-benefit analysis in an abstract context. I would imagine that is a major concern for most consulting companies. How quickly and effectively can people do cost-benefit analyses? That would be my guess. If I study for the GMAT but study GRE words at the same time, would it be possible or easy for me to switch to the GRE later on? Crystal, yes, it would. The question then becomes, how many hours a day do you have? An expectation for either of these tests would be you'd want to at least be able to study for 10 to 15 hours a week. If you're going to study for the GMAT and tackle vocabulary at the same time, you need to up that to 20 to 25 hours a week. If you have that time, you absolutely can do it. But just make an acknowledgement of the amount of time you have before you try to dive into that mindset. Since consulting and banking prefer the GMAT, does this mean that the GMAT is preferred by the GRE B schools considering employment opportunities? No, actually. Not that I have ever heard, certainly. Most schools, if you ask, take the position of, if we preferred one over the other, we would not accept both. Or take the position of, we will consider the other test, but we do have a preference for this test. They will tell you. The vast majority of them, it does not matter. 4 months is enough to get me a score good enough for target one school. Blair, if you recognize that at the end of the day, these tests are not about algebra. There is math tested on these tests. However, the majority of these questions are not about complicated algebra. They're about how do you organize your thoughts and how do you take advantage of, how do you lay out a good process for a question type. Right, a few next steps for us to make sure that we mention here. First and foremost, sit in on a class. You can sit in on any of our classes for the first class as a trial student. See what it's like. Take a practice test. If you're not sure on which test you would be better for you, do a little bit of research on the question types for each. Take one practice test of each type. Please, for the love of all that is good and beautiful in your life, take those practice tests at least a week apart from each other. With 4 minutes left in this conversation, I can't really get into the actual mechanics of why right now, but there are honest to God, very demanding reasons why you do not want to take a practice test within any time frame less than 4 days. Certainly, a week is better. And then if you have questions, email or give us a call. So that is the last components of the standard presentation here. We do have a few more minutes left. Questions, comments, concerns that remain? I'm just staring patiently at my phone, waiting to see if anybody has any more questions in the chat. One more thing I will say while I'm waiting to see if anybody's doing something in the chat. When you take that practice test, keep in mind that score on the practice test may be the less important factor than comfort with the test framework. Keep that in mind as well. All right, let's see what we have here. If I take both practice tests but get scores that are quite far from my target score, what would be the best way to figure out which test best suits me? Crystal, what you would want to do then is if the practice test does not give you clear direction, take a first class for each test. On the basis of the discussion in that first class, then make the decision on which test you want to prepare for. If the practice test does not give you clear indication on its own, then it's an idea of which of the two classes, the first GRE class or the first GMAT class, presents material that is more comfortable for you. Other questions, concerns? Want to apply for Masters of Science in Economics. Is it true that the GRE is preferred? Yassine, Masters and PhD programs in specific disciplines that are not an MBA, that is completely and utterly school specific. I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer for that question, but that is something that every specific program chooses for themselves. I would not do all practice questions using the whiteboard on the GMAT yet. I recommend easing into it. Start by doing maybe for a week. Do all of your first attempts on questions on regular pen and paper. Then any questions you wish to review, do your review and rework of those questions on the whiteboard. So make the first week's worth of whiteboard work questions you've already seen. You are now reworking them for more comfort with that question and to start introducing the whiteboard interface. Then start making half of your work the next week, your first attempts on the whiteboard. Third week, all of your work on the whiteboard. At the end of the third week, take a practice test. Yes, please. We love those like buttons. Love those like buttons? Like those like buttons? I don't know which would be better there. Do I recommend memorizing vocab before the practice GRE test? Actually, no. You do not want to do that. Take the first test relatively cold in terms of content. Know the timing, know the question types, but do not study content. That first practice test, if you have not studied content, can give you guidance on which content is more important for you to study. And on the GRE, you would be looking at those vocab-based questions and saying to yourself, upon review, how many of these questions did I miss because I just did not know the meaning of the words? Versus how many of these questions did I miss despite knowing all of the words? If you miss nearly equal number of questions, even though you knew all of the words, you then need to study process and structural studies for those question types, not vocabulary. You do vocabulary second. If, on the other hand, the only times you missed questions were because you did not know the words, then you start with vocab studies. But you don't want to pollute that analysis with the work done in vocab before you start it. Oh, Mr. Great One. How many questions are we allowed to get wrong per section for each of the tests? On the GMAT, there is no reliable answer for that because it is purely how many questions. It is purely what was the difficulty level of the questions you were getting wrong. But I will say, roughly speaking, to get into the 700s on the GMAT, you want to be able to answer 3 out of 4 quant questions correctly. And I would say probably 4 out of 5 on the verbal, but verbal is where it gets even more wonky. And that's a very, very, very rough benchmark of me trying to answer a question, which is, bluntly speaking, not a possible question to answer, but that is my best attempt. On the GRE, you really, on the GRE, only want to miss 1, maximum 2 questions on the first of each section. And then on the second question, you can miss up to around 4 to 5. For a quant heavy split, 750 on the GMAT. First of all, do not try to plan for a 750 on the GMAT. Once you get past a 730, it's a game of luck. Once you get past a 730, you're reaching the point where all the scores are 99th percentile, which means that there is no differentiation in skill. From 760 to 800, there is no differentiation at all in the skill of the person taking the test. It's just a did you have a good day, or did you happen to have a test which hit more of your stronger areas? Now, that said, quant heavy split, you'd want to have at least a 50 on quant, and you'd probably want to have a 40 to 42 on verbal. That is a rough call on the numbers. That's about where you'd want to be. Probably closer to a 44 on verbal. I mean, realistically, if you want a 750 on the GMAT, you need to pretty much max out the test. My pleasure, Anisha. Nagarajan, yeah. I don't know. When would I be returning back? When I'm invited back, I guess. I enjoy doing this, but this is. I have my colleagues and we enjoy doing these things, and you can't hog them all. That's not fair to your friends. All right, everybody. It is actually about 4 to 5 minutes past the associated time for this session, so we do need to call it a day. Does anybody have any last questions before we close out? It has been my pleasure. It really has. I wish all of you the best of luck. Have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you may be. And who knows, maybe I'll actually be seeing you in one of my classes soon. PULDGR8. I can't answer that without knowing the difficulty level of the questions. You need to look at the, if those are official guide questions, you need to break it into thirds. The first third, middle third, and later third. In the first third of any chapter of the official guide, you want your accuracy to be above 90%. In the middle third, you want your chapter to be between 70 to 80%. And in the last third, ideally, you want your accuracy to around 60 to 65%. So just blanket percentages like that, it doesn't actually correspond to the scoring. Medium high, you'd want a medium high, you'd really, if you want to get into like the highest scores, you'd really want your accuracy to be around 80 to 85% on medium high. And then on hard to nightmare or hard to devilish, you'd want your accuracy to be around 60%. So you're close, very close. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Good luck to you. And maybe I'll see you again.